In late 1871, the richest jeweler in America holds a dirty rough stone between his fingers. His name is Charles Lewis Tiffany, and in late 1871, his opinion carried national weight. The pouch had come east from San Francisco, carried by men who claimed they had found diamonds in the American West. They were rough stones, which mattered, because finished jewels were Tiffany's world and rough stones belonged to a murkier one, halfway between luxury and geology. In his 1913 memoir, Asbury Harpending claimed Tiffany valued the sample at roughly $150,000. From that point on, the pouch stopped behaving like a curiosity and started behaving like collateral. Once Tiffany seemed satisfied, the sample traveled in words as much as in leather. And those words reached men already eager to believe. Before anyone saw a mine, the pouch had already become evidence. To understand why the lie worked, start in San Francisco. The city had already been taught to think in mineral miracles. Gold had trained the city to believe in buried luck, and silver had trained it to scale that belief into finance. Every serious man in town was waiting for the next field. At the center of that appetite stood William C. Ralston of the Bank of California. His bank was the financial nerve center of the Pacific Coast. Then 2 Kentucky prospectors walked in carrying a pouch full of stones. By 1871, a new stone did not sound absurd. It sounded familiar. And the West still looked unfinished enough to hold one more miracle. Their names were Philip Arnold and John Slack. Arnold was the persuasive one, a veteran miner who knew exactly how much detail a lie could survive, and exactly how much silence made it stronger. Slack read more like a follower than an architect. They would not say exactly where the stones came from. That was the first move of the con, secrecy, which turns ignorance into value. Before anyone saw a mine, powerful men were already reacting to a sample and a secret. Once the Bank of California agreed to hold the pouch, Arnold had something better than a witness. He had borrowed the bank's own reputation. By the time the 2 men walked back into daylight, curiosity was already working for them. Asbury Harpending became the inside operator, carrying frontier rumor into Eastern respectability. The trip itself enlarged the myth. Every mile between San Francisco and New York made the pouch feel less like a curiosity and more like a discovery. And in New York, there was no more valuable imprimatur than Tiffany. In Harpending's 1913 memoir, Tiffany supposedly called the stones beyond question precious stones of enormous value, a judgment Harpending himself later admitted was, in his words, hard to comprehend once everyone remembered the sample was rough and the mine itself still unseen. That is the crucial distortion of the whole fraud. Tiffany had only examined a pouch. Investors heard that he had authenticated a field. Harpending's real talent was not geology. It was moving the story through rooms where rich men repeated it to one another. By the time the story turned into letters, telegrams, and dinner table talk, the appraisal had acquired a second life, one much larger than the sample that produced it. The next authority figure would not be a jeweler. It would be a mining engineer. The sample was now wrapped in names: Tiffany, Ralston, McClellan, Janin. That was the fraud's real armor. General George B. McClellan joined the board. On paper, the company now stood at $10 million in authorized capital. Then Henry Janin went west to inspect the ground. This was the dangerous step for Arnold, because Janin was supposed to save rich men from exactly this kind of embarrassment. He was a serious, respected engineer, which is precisely why his mistake would be so catastrophic. He was sampling the very surface Arnold wanted sampled, a planted skin of earth arranged to reward exactly that kind of inspection. A favorable report from Janin did what Tiffany never could. It made the ground itself look legitimate. After that, directors were no longer buying a rumor. They could tell themselves they were buying engineering. A later mining paper quoting Janin's report said he was satisfied of the absolute genuineness of the diamond fields and wanted enough adjacent ground for one great corporation to control the gem market. But a favorable report does not plant gems in the dirt. By the summer of 1872, Arnold was in London because the field now had to be restocked by hand. Hatton Garden gave him what the West could not: stones without a mine. Not polished jewels for a display case. Cheap, rough material by the lot. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and garnets. A mixture good enough to fool investors and strange enough to betray him later. That spread between cheap material and expensive belief is where the profit lived. Then the fraud crossed the Atlantic again. And somewhere in the high country, Arnold salted the field. A little here, a little there, enough surface evidence to make a guided inspection feel miraculous. Harpending's later explanation was blunt. Sharp iron rods opened the dirt, gems were dropped in, and the holes were closed with a hard stamp of the foot. The mix itself was a tell. Nature does not normally scatter diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and garnets together in one neat little miracle. The cost was only a fraction of what the field seemed worth. The inspection trip was designed to make doubt harder, because the trip itself would become part of the fraud. The journey began respectably, on the railroad. Then the rails gave way to stage and horseback, and the world outside the party's vision began to narrow. That mattered because every hidden mile stripped Janin of the one thing that might have saved him: the ability to read the country for himself. By then the trip, the secrecy, and Tiffany's earlier appraisal had already done half the work. Janin arrived primed to confirm, not to dismantle. A modern map shows what they were prevented from seeing. Isolation was not just scenery, it was part of the proof. Janin walked the site, found stones where the guides wanted him to find them, and mistook a staged surface for a natural deposit. His report did more than say the stones were real. It turned the ground into something financiers could discuss without feeling like fools. Harpending later wrote that the party became cross and quarrelsome, which is exactly what happens when men are being led and not allowed to orient themselves. By the time Janin reached the mesa, the site was no longer just land. It was a performance built for him. When he said yes, the fraud had technical cover. Once Janin signed, the hoax stopped behaving like a secret and started behaving like a company. On paper, it was worth $10 million. In cash, it raised far less, but still enough to make the fraud life-changing. McClellan's name made the board look national. Ralston's name made it look safe. Arnold and Slack had every reason to disappear before the ground was looked at too carefully. Paper wealth had acquired engraved borders, signatures, and the look of permanence. For Arnold, that was enough. He did not need the company to succeed. He needed time. Back on the ground, the field was still only theater, and somewhere else in that same mountain belt, Clarence King had already spent years learning what real Western geology looked like. The man who would break the hoax did not arrive through money or prestige. He arrived through maps. Clarence King ran the 40th Parallel Survey and knew the country where the field was said to be. To a financier, the rumor sounded exciting. To King, it sounded wrong. He took Samuel Emmons and other survey men with him. King heard the same rumor investors heard, but it bothered him for a simple reason. The story described spectacular stones, not the kind of country that should have produced them. His authority came from years already spent in that country, and his advantage was not intuition but memory, map work, and a second trained eye in Samuel Emmons. King did not start with luck. He started with terrain. Janin had described enough topography, water, and vegetation that King could treat the report like a puzzle, not where diamonds might be, but which basin fit Janin's own route. He was not guessing at a continent. He was checking a piece of country his own survey had already learned. And then they found the field. The very ease of finding stones made the place look less convincing. The deduction came first from ridges, streams, and distances, and only then from stones. That was when the rumor stopped being abstract and turned back into a physical place that could be checked. When they finally saw the place whole, it already looked less like a discovery than a stage. The first easy find looked less like luck than placement. King broke the story by reading the ground like a witness. One stone was freshly scarred, bearing the mark of a tool, not of geology. The jumble of gems was a geological impossibility. Diamonds and rubies lying together in a way nature rarely permits. Harpending later admitted it was a fact that ought to have made a goat do some responsible thinking. Again and again, the richest-looking ground was the most recently disturbed. King did not need a confession. The field contradicted itself. Now he had to warn the men who had put their names behind it. One strange stone might be luck. A repeating human pattern is a hoax. Taken together, the finds looked curated rather than discovered. By nightfall, the question was no longer whether the field was real. It was how quickly the warning could reach San Francisco. On November 11th, Clarence King sent the board of directors a written warning that the field was fraudulent. On November 26, 1872, the San Francisco Chronicle broke the story in print. The syndicate collapsed not because the West had no diamonds, but because this field had been built by hand. For Henry Janin, the humiliation was absolute. His professional signature had been exposed as worthless. Charles Tiffany's reputation survived, but one of the most trusted names in American luxury had just helped certify a lie. And whatever the hoax cost Ralston, it did not cause the later collapse of his bank. Ralston now had to choose between the engineer and the geologist. The fraud took months to build and only days to break. Once the press got hold of it, secrecy was finished. By the 27th, the trustees were admitting that the properties were salted and that everyone had been cleverly duped. And the shame traveled east as fast as the first sample had. The ugliest part of the story comes after the exposure. Arnold was sued, but a civil suit is a small answer to a man who has already pocketed the money and gone home. Later accounts put the settlement at roughly $150,000. But Arnold, the architect of the lie, simply went back to Kentucky. After a modest settlement, he kept the vast majority of his take. For the men he had fooled, that was the final obscene injustice. The con man went home rich. Harpending later wrote that the late diamond millionaires presented a sad spectacle on the street. He meant it as a flourish. But the humiliation was real. Janin's name was damaged, Ralston had vouched with his bank, and the famous general on the board had lent his own reputation to a fraud. The story ended far from San Francisco, in Kentucky courtrooms where one of the year's biggest frauds was reduced to a civil dispute. In Kentucky, it became a civil problem, not a moral one. That is why the ending feels wrong. Exposure did not cancel ordinary life for Arnold. That is what makes the story bitter instead of satisfying. And Slack remained fittingly harder to hold in the frame, disappearing from the historical record almost as quietly as he had entered it. King did not get rich. He got what the episode had been about all along: institutional authority. In 1879, he became the first director of the United States Geological Survey. In the end, the object at the center of the scandal was never majestic. It was just cheap stone, handled by the right men in the right order, until one geologist looked at the ground instead of the story. King's victory folded into the rise of federal science. And the tools that beat the hoax were ordinary ones: map, notebook, ground. No emperor's jewel, no lost wonder, just evidence, badly planted, and finally read correctly.